Hi, I'm Diane Ellis, Director of the FDIC's Division of Insurance and Research, and I would like to welcome you to the first of our 5-part webinar series on data. This event was originally planned to be in person on the beautiful campus of our partner at University of Santa Clara, but that was not to be. So we switched to a virtual format. Now, one of the advantages of this virtual format is our ability to accommodate more attendees. We have over 1,600 people that have registered for this series, so we are very pleased to be able to share this content and the discussion with a wider audience. One housekeeping note before we start is that we ask that you please post any questions for any of the speakers in the chat. We'll make sure that our moderator, who is Sanjeev Das today, gets those questions and asks them of the panelists. Now I want to turn the floor over to FDIC Chairman Jelena McWilliams to officially kick off our series. Chairman McWilliams joined the FDIC in June of 2018, and she immediately made innovation, fintech, and related issues a top priority at the FDIC. This series follows on a conference we had 2 years ago on fintech, and as with that event, our goal is to bring together academics, policymakers, and industry participants for discussions on these important issues. So please join me now in welcoming Chairman McWilliams to introduce our series with some brief remarks. Chairman?
Thank you so much, Diane. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the potential uses of big and alternative data in banking and what that means for bankers and their customers. Let me start by thanking you, Diane, and your staff, including Rachel Cloud, Andrea Ely, Ed Garnett, Chaco George, and Ebony Oliver, for their exceptional efforts in organizing today's event, along with Professor Sanjeev Das and our partners at the Santa Clara University Leavey School of Business. Put simply, we couldn't do it without you. This webinar is the first of a series of events that combine 3 components critical to the FDIC's mission: innovation, research, and data. Since my first day as chairman, I have made no secret of my belief in the power of innovation. And I'll tell you a secret. It's partly because 20 plus years ago, I started out my legal career not too far away from Santa Clara University on Page Mill Road in Palo Alto. And ever since that time, I have strongly believed that innovation has so much potential to move us forward as a society, and if used wisely and prudently, can make everybody's life better. Early in my tenure at the FDIC, we established a new Office of Innovation. We call it FDI Tech, to promote innovation at not just the agency, but across the banking sector as well. Led by our first Chief Innovation Officer, Sultan Megji, we're actively engaging with banks, fintechs, and other stakeholders on the full spectrum of issues, including data, analytics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and more. To support these efforts, one of my first initiatives as chairman was to host the agency's first FinTech Research Conference that united high-quality research and practical experience in pursuit of sound public policy. During that conference, I referred to data as a new currency. If data is new currency, then big data is the economy. If you have access to big data, you can change the world, literally. Big data has the potential to create a more secure financial system, one that builds resilience and reduces financial crime. Big data also offers the promise to provide for a more inclusive financial system that offers affordable access to financial services and products for our most vulnerable populations. Unlocking the full potential of big data and building a more resilient banking system are not and do not have to be mutually exclusive goals. We can respect privacy and protect against fraud while building an equitable, inclusive system through the responsible use of big data. At the FDIC, we acknowledge the promises and responsibilities that come with data. In response, we're modernizing how we do our jobs as regulators, supervisors, the resolution authority, and the agency entrusted with the Deposit Insurance Fund. The way we worked 10, 20, 30 years ago has evolved. And with that, so has our relationship to interconnectedness with and reliance on data. Today, we're leveraging new data and analytics tools to strengthen our research capabilities and improve the way we supervise financial institutions. A modern FDIC, however, is not built in a vacuum. I like to put it this way. This is not your grandmother's FDIC, but it cannot exist on its own. This webinar series offers the opportunity for us and our fellow regulators to engage with industry, innovators, and academia to inform the policies that will guide us forward. Today, experts from coast to coast, from Stanford and Santa Clara in the heart of Silicon Valley to MIT on this coast and everybody in between, will discuss the methodologies, tools, and techniques used to derive information from large data sets. At research conferences like this, through partnerships with pioneering banks and tech companies, and in a regulatory environment that fosters and supports the development of new technologies, we ought to work together to speed this process and create the banking system of the future far more quickly. This openness, transparency, and engagement helps build trust. Our webinar series will dive into consumer impacts, artificial intelligence and machine learning, open banking, and how we can improve financial regulation in the world of big data. I told you, this is not your grandmother's FDIC. I look forward to each of these conversations and welcome brave, novel ideas to inform and challenge the FDIC as we foster innovation to propel the banking system forward. And now I will turn the program over to Sanjeev, without whose help we wouldn't be here today having this webinar. Please, Sanjeev, take it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman McWilliams, for a very kind and wonderful introduction to this webinar series. And as you did say, I think we have so many people to be grateful for actually putting this all together. So I just want to thank everyone you mentioned as well. And a group of people at Santa Clara as well did a lot of work to get this going. Professor So-Young Kim, Professor Dan Trepanier, Emily Wilcox, and Jalissa in the Dean's office was helpful and supportive as well. I'm going to pick a quote that you mentioned, which is "Data is the new currency." And there's a happy coincidence that both our speakers are going to be touching. One of them is going to be touching upon alternative data, and the other one is going to be touching about on a new currency. So we've literally got both these things in the first talk today. What's also interesting is that the original intention here was to bring the regulator and banking sectors together with the tech sector. And once again, our two speakers sort of epitomize that. We've got one person on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. We've got finance on the East Coast. We've got tech on the West Coast. And we also have MIT on the East Coast and Stanford on the West Coast. So we've sort of got this bi-coastal connection through this wonderful webinar series. So without much ado, I'm going to start off by introducing Roberto, who's going to be our first speaker. And I just want to inform the audience that, once again, if you have comments and questions, please drop them in the chat. The chat will be in the bottom right panel or the bottom right quadrant of the screen that you see. And please feel free to drop in as many questions and comments as you feel you want to add. All right, I will introduce Roberto now. Roberto doesn't need any introduction. I think he's well known for many, many different fields of work. Roberto is the Society of Sloan Fellows Professor of Management and a Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Roberto is also a research associate at the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he's a member of the Census Bureau's Scientific Advisory Committee and a visiting professor at IESA. Roberto is a Venezuelan economist whose area of research has spanned many, many different fields, from international economics, monetary economics, development economics, focused on balance of payments crises, financial crises, propagation of these across countries, and contagion. Roberto also studies the properties of international pricing practices, producing alternative measures of inflation, and he's got two very interesting big data projects that he's going to be talking about, some big data, some small, but mostly in the area of alternative data for economists and the banking sector. Roberto joined MIT in 1997. He's been there ever since. Roberto is also an incredible teacher, and he's won the Teacher of the Year award and the Excellence in Teaching award at MIT 3 times, which is a pretty great lift. So that's amazing. Coincidentally, Roberto got his PhD at MIT as well, and is an electrical engineer, by training originally. So Roberta, I'll hand it over to you, and look forward to your talk, and we'll circle back with questions later.
Good. Thank you so much, Sanjeev, and thank you so much, Chairman McWilliams, for the invitation of being here. It's a great pleasure and a great honor. And as Sanjeev said, I by accident I am both an engineer and an economist, and it happens to be that I have found a way to combine the two trainings and work on this area. I also want to say that I am from Venezuela. My dad was from Argentina. So we Latin Americans, we have what is known like FDIC super envy, okay? We don't have any institution remotely as professional, as good as the FDIC in our countries. You have no idea how much we envy you. Maybe that's the reason why I moved to the United States. So it is a fantastic institution, and listening to the chairman, I can only envision the great things that you will continue to do. So congratulations on that. And I agree with what you said is we have the chance to make the financial system safe, robust. We can make it inclusive. We can make it fair, and we can make it more personalized. And therefore, your efforts here are going to actually produce tremendous welfare, and not only in the United States, but almost every country that will follow your lead. So congratulations on that. Let me start. I don't call this big data, and maybe this is because I'm old, and in my time it was not called artificial intelligence. It was called optimal control when I started learning the same techniques. And I love an application that is used or a classification that is used in the census. The next slide, please. In the census, they talk about three things. Next slide, please. So we talk about surveys, administrative data, and what people call big data. Truly, they divide it in two parts. One that is called design data, and the other one that is called organic data. The design data is the one that the data is collected with a purpose. So what we want is to, when we collect the census, we want to know how many people do we have, where they live, what is the size of the, the establishment where they're living, how many, their ethnicity, etc. So we have a certain set of questions, and then we think about it. Well, to whom should we ask? How do we ask so we get the answers to be truthful, etc. So it has a very top-down approach in the sense that we start with a question and then we start to think about, well, to whom should we ask? What should we do? Those are more or less the things that are collected in the census. Now, thinking more broadly, the IRS, given that we're close to time to start filing, in the IRS is also a survey. It's also a design survey, because they ask that you classify all your expenses and your income in certain categories. You put them in little boxes, and the purpose is to know what is your tax liability. And that's kind of again, it's a survey. It's a very good question that they want to ask. They know to whom to ask. They know how to collect it to be able to answer that question. And there are many sources that are administrative data that have that flavor, both in the public and in the private sector. Things like human resources are also data sets that we tend to call them alternative, but I like the idea of thinking of them as design data. The design data is costly to collect, mainly because it's terribly intrusive. In fact, almost all of you are going to get an email from the FDIC after this conference that is going to ask you, how was the conference? Do you like the speakers, the time, the Q&A, the platform? If you were there physically, I can only envision what we could have done, 1,600 people in Santa Clara. That would have been a great rave. So I'm really looking forward to next year. Next year, I want to be invited independently if I'm speaking or not. So I just wonder what we could do. But they're going to ask you about the aspects of the conference, and I can assure you, not a single person receives that email with happiness. I mean, no one says, "Can I actually fill 2 surveys?" I mean, like it's very, very, very intrusive, and design data that has that flavor. Is that we are collecting the data with a purpose, And we want individuals to be truthful in the answering of that data. And in the process, we become very, very intrusive. And some of them are extremely intrusive, like healthcare data, which will be not only incredibly private, but in order to collect it is incredibly intrusive. I mean, every time you go to a new doctor, you have to put your history of your health. No one does that with happiness, no one. The other data set, which is the one that they call organic data set in the census, is the one that we generate without knowing. It's the one that we generate because we interact with devices that those devices track us. So the beauty of that data is that it's very little intrusive. I mean, when I am actually visiting web pages in Google, I don't know that somebody, well, I know that somebody's tracking me, but it is costless for me to provide that information, the GPS, some of the transactions that I do on the phone, for example, my car. Every vehicle in the United States today has about 100 CPUs that are generating data. The fleet of Ford generates in 1 month the same amount of data that Google collects in 10 years. So this is the size of the amount of data. I don't know what they do with the data anyway, but the point is, it's amazingly large, the data sets, and we are generating that data set with very little effort. So one of the beauties of organic data is that because of it's cheaper to collect, of course, because of this feature that is non-intrusive. But second, we tend to be very truthful in the answering of those questions. Now, there are two different things about organic data. One is aspirational, the other one is transactional. And of course, these are not extremes. There's areas of gray here. But the aspirational is, it will be kind of Facebook, where I am not who I am, is who I would like to be. And the transactional one will be, for example, the best example of organic data that is transaction is my DNA, okay, that I'm just throwing away every single second of the day. I work mostly with transactional data. I want to clarify that. I think that both are very important. If I were in marketing, aspirational data is extremely important. I don't care that much what you are wearing. I would like to know what you would like to purchase. So in that sense, both data are extremely important, but almost all my work has been on organic data that is transactional, and that's what I'd like to highlight. The disadvantage of organic data is that it's non-representative. It's very non-representative. So we need to find a way to correct for the biases that will appear in organic data. And the way I have done this, and I'm going to show you two examples of that, is that I think that of doing a hybrid approach is that I use the design data as a way to correct the biases of the organic data. And that's and I'm going to show you the examples in how I put the two things together. So in other words, I truly don't think that these alternative data sources are going to substitute the ones that we are already collecting. They're going to be complementary, because it's really difficult to actually collect the quality of every data point that we collect when we are designing the data. So when the census or we do the population survey or any of these surveys, we put a huge amount of effort in trying to understand exactly the quality of every data point. And in doing so, that means that the informational content of that small data is tremendously large. When I try to replicate that with the phones, and I look at the actual data on GPS, it has massive amount of noise. I have to do massive amount of approximations. And in the end, the quality is lower in terms of the information content of every data point. So next slide. The first thing I want to do is kind of criticize a little bit the problems that we have with many current measures. And I'm going to relate this a lot with the ESG. So I'm going to actually, this is not true with inflation rate, but it's true with anything that we measure about the environment and social aspect and governance that we do. We tend to concentrate mostly on extreme events. So imagine when I try to measure the drug consumption in any city, mostly what we do is we count the number of kids that enter an emergency room. That's actually not the average consumption of drugs. That is an extreme event, which is the overdoses. We could measure the extreme events, and the way I always think about that is, well, instead of measuring the overdoses, why don't you measure the average consumption in the city? And when they ask me, where is that information? I said, in the sewage. If you give me authorization, I can actually tell you how much cocaine is, because I know how the cocaine will be metabolized in the body, and I can see that in the sewage of the country or the city. Furthermore, for opioids, I can tell you if the opioid was synthetic or not synthetic, if it was ingested or it was injected. Because the chemistry changes. I know that it was thrown in the can as opposed to be actually ingested by the individual. So we know. So I can know. Now, I will not know the extreme events, but I will know the average. Now, they don't give me authorization to go to the sewage, so I don't get it. I know it can be done. That doesn't mean that we can do it. But it's important for us to measure events in the middle. So we measure sexual harassment. How? By paying attention to, for example, complaints in labor court. That sounds like an extreme event. I have 2 daughters. I don't want them to be so upset in a job that they feel compelled to go to a court to file a complaint. So I would prefer to actually catch the bad environment earlier than that. So we measure too much of these extreme events. Those because they are visible and easy. I understand that, but we can do better. Also, we measure things that are incredibly infrequent. For example, I am measuring domestic violence in many countries. And unfortunately, look at what we did with COVID. So we have people, we force them to be at the place where the violence takes place. And in those households, we submit them to a humongous amount of stress by producing unemployment, by lowering their income. And in the US, this was stressful. I just want you to imagine how stressful that was in Latin America. I'm trying to measure that in Latin America. How do we know what has happened in domestic violence? By the way, the surveys were not run last year because the survey, you need to be at a house to ask what is happening in terms of violence. So we have no clue what has happened. Very unlikely we're actually going to run those surveys this year. If lucky, we're going to be learning about that in 2022. Very difficult to make choices when you measure once a year or when you measure once when you can. A lot of the actions that we take are based on perception, not necessarily on values. We tend to react a lot to what happened in the news or what happened recently. Therefore, we have a spur of willingness to measure civil rights because something is happening about civil rights in the United States. But that means that 2 or 3 years later, when the society doesn't have the same amount of energy, we just don't pay attention. Human rights violations, another area where I work a lot, especially on human trafficking, has exactly that issue, is that we get outraged by one event and then everybody wants to see a measure and we do some effort and then 3 months later, the efforts die completely. Right now in the United States, for example, almost all the police effort, law enforcement effort on human trafficking has been shut down because of budget. Lastly, we're fixated in some statistics that create this false sense of accomplishment. And this is something that we pay attention to one statistic. When we make sure that that statistic is close to 0, then we think that we have done our job. And again, in the city of Boston, they were very happy when the number of people that were dying of an overdose had declined significantly. And my question was, why is that declining? Because people are not consuming drugs or because you have become better at actually saving them? And it happened to be that it was the second one. And then it creates a false sense of accomplishment when you are concentrated on that statistics. So I think that when you think about the role of a regulator FDIC, you measure a lot of extreme events. Hopefully you don't measure them infrequently. I know that you don't measure based on perception. And we can improve some of the statistics that we compute from those banks for sure. And I think that the access to organic data will allow us to have the ability to do those activities better, and not only on the FDIC, but everywhere. So the next slide, some of the opportunities that I am thinking of is to produce not measures that substitute, but measures that are more timely, measures that are more dynamic in the sense that we are able to change the weights much faster. Right now in the United States, we still have the exact same weight on the CPI of restaurant consumption. So I don't know how many of you are eating in restaurants, or how many of you are traveling, how many of you are actually going to entertainment and baseball games. So all those weights in our statistics are exactly today the same as they were in 2019, exactly the same. Those sectors have had massive declines in prices. So we are overestimating the deflation, for sure. So now I'm pretty sure that 2 years from now, we would probably have the same weights. So it's just a transitory effect. But we are not measuring correctly what is happening right now. So we have the opportunity to create more timely measures, more dynamic measures that respond to how things move in the economy, and also to have ability to be more transparent. Okay, so next slide. So in fact, let's go when I show all the 5 bullet points on the next slide. So the pillars of modern measure, kind of the things, so you can go all the way until it appears the number 5. So there are 5 pillars of, I think, how we can do these measurements. And these measurements have to be hybrid in the sense that I want them to be continuous measures. So we need to do this electronically, and we need to do this in a non-intrusive manner. So we cannot rely on surveys all the time. So there's a big challenge about how to understand social measures and how to do this better in relatively fast. So I will talk a little bit about some of those. Some of those measures are more intrusive. I'm working on trying to understand the micro aggressions that happens in the labor force in the United States toward women, toward African Americans, etc. Those are a little bit more intrusive than I would like to, but anyway, we're still working, and if I have time, I can talk about that. But this is about the collection of the data. I think that having continuous measures and non-intrusive is a key feature, and that's where the organic data will play a very important role. Second, we need to have open source, and the reason is that whatever we're collecting today is going to be different 5 years from now. So we better have the ability to discuss publicly how we want to manage the new characteristics of the data, the new availability of the data. So open source is a very important aspect. So we need to be more transparent there. At the same time, because we're dealing with very individual data, we need to actually have a big concern about privacy. So we just have to make sure that morally questionable questions are not addressed. Now, something that I have learned through this is that any measure that has these 4 characteristics will be, by construction, be imperfect. And that's where the hybrid approach is crucial. So we need to learn to live with the 2 types of measures that one might be slow moving and one might be very costly to collect. The other one is cheap to collect, is fast moving, but is imperfect. Next slide, let me show you first the first project that we did, which was the Billion Prices project. This is something that started with Alberto Cavallo. He's now at Harvard. And what we did was to try to think about how we can compute inflation rate much faster. Next slide. This shows all the countries that are covered in our data set. There's one country in Latin America. We actually started in Latin America. It was Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Colombia, the countries that started. And the reason why we started there is that I knew either the owner or the son or daughter of the owner. I knew them because they had stopped by MIT in the Sloan School. So I was able to get access to their web pages to collect the data. So we started in Latin America. We had friends. And I don't know if you noticed, but Paraguay is not collected. And the main reason is because the only time when Venezuela was going to qualify for the World Cup, we lost the last game against Paraguay. So Paraguay is an enemy nation for me. So I don't collect data from them. So next slide. So what do we do? What we did was to change a little bit the way we collected the data. So the way we collect inflation rate is that we go to stores, and in those stores, we collect prices. We weight them by the consumption basket, and then we produce a price for that consumption basket. We look at the evolution of that price, and that's what we call inflation. So what we thought was, and by the way, we started in 2006. So at the time when there was very difficult to collect prices online, at the time was mostly food and a little bit of electronics, truly, a lot of books and music, but it was relatively small, the number of sectors. So we were very, incomplete in what we were producing at the beginning. We learned how to collect from PDF files and to get tariff from electricity and tuition from school pamphlets and stuff like that. So we had to learn how to collect the data. But the whole point was, if it was on the internet, I need to collect prices that were representative. And so this is the key. What determines representative is, well, I knew what the census and the BLS were collecting, for example. So I wanted to collect a proxy for that. Now, we don't collect all the sectors. Still today, there are many sectors that we don't have the information. Because, healthcare, for example, we have the cost of insurance, but we don't have many of the aspects of that will constitute part of the provision of healthcare. But again, what we do is we take a hybrid approach. We use the data from the BLS to combine with the data that we produce here to try to produce these daily indexes. Next slide. So this is Argentina. The reason why we started was because in 2006, Argentina intervened the statistical office with the purpose to manipulate the inflation data. The reason why they did that is because the inflation rate in Argentina, the debt was indexed to the inflation rate. So if you change the inflation rate from 12 to 6, well, you have just reduced your interest payment or interest liability by a lot. So this is the official data. It goes back, I know it's hard to see, but it goes back just to mid-2007. And this data, I just put kind of at the end of 2019. I eliminated COVID from here because it doesn't make any sense just to look at that. But I just wanted to show you the very small discrepancy that exists between the official data and the one that we computed online. The next slide, please. And as you can see, it's just a tiny bit. This is the price index of Argentina. The official data has about 140% inflation rate. In 10 years, we have about something like 750. I remember a reporter called me like middle of 2014, asking me what was the discrepancy between the official data and the online data, cumulative. And I said it was only 1 digit. And the guy said, oh, only 1 digit, that's good. They said, well, the official is 400, ours is 540. It's only, so from 40, it's only 1 digit. It's just on the wrong side of this one. By the way, the next slide will show you what has been happening since the government change. Here I extended a little bit of the data. So between the two blue lines, there's a period of 6 months where actually no data was produced in Argentina. We actually helped the central bank to be able to produce that inflation rate. Since that time, in May of 2017, they have been producing the data by themselves. And you can see that there's a tremendous accuracy between the online and the offline. The next slide will show you a little bit of what happened in the United States. This was during the Lehman Brothers collapse. And what was impressive in the United States is that on September 16, between 16 and 17, so 2 days after Lehman goes bankrupt, 75% of the products in our data set actually started to go down. And you can see how fast our index started to go down. Not only that, you can see that actually we rebounded much earlier. We didn't know this at the time when we were doing that. Let me show you the next slide, which is the United States. I did this about a week and a half ago. By the way, right now in the East Coast is 3:34 p.m. That means that right now I have the inflation rate from 81 countries already computed for today, because we download the data from every single country at 2 a.m. And in fact, before noon or Eastern time, I have the inflation rate for every country. And they're not identical, and I will never expect them to be identical. These are different markets. They are not only different markets, is that there are different weights. Some of our weights today respond to what happened to the web pages. And by the way, our index have changed through time, but you can see the CPI is remarkably close. The US is not the one that tracks the closest, it's actually the United Kingdom. It's just like it is. And the reason is that the web pages in the United Kingdom behave very closely to what is happening to the offline business. So here, remember, I'm not predicting anything. I'm just measuring what happened yesterday. Let me just show you the next slide, which is shows what is happening since COVID and a little bit of the current time. And again, this actually is 2 weeks old, but so we have another measure right now, if I could show you. But you can see, if you were able to see the data, actually our prices started to go down before the end of February. So this peak that you see in the middle, when it starts to come down before the statistical office even detects the inflation rate, it was kind of the US citizens were reacting to the pandemic in Europe and the possibility that we were shutting down, and they actually reacted early. Something that is remarkable is that you can also see very fast, and this is not that I'm predicting anything. Again, this is just the retailer. This is Walmart and Amazon, and all of them are increasing prices right in December. So you can see that happening. By the way, we are seeing a lot of inflation in the last 4 months in our data. If you annualize that inflation rate in the last 4 months, even if you exclude oil, we get about 5 to 6% inflation rate. So I'm not showing this here, but we have had a very, very massive increase in inflation rate lately. So let me now talk about ESG measurements. I will actually go relatively fast through here, and then then we can look at the ESG measures. Okay, so the next slide, please. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and there are many rating agencies that those rating agencies, what they are trying to do is to compute the ethical behavior of firms. What these rating agencies are trying to, in some sense, do is to understand what is the impact that firms have in many different categories. Now, these categories go all over the place. They start from issues like the environment and CO2 emissions, to aspects like community impact, to line on the marketing practices, use of water, electromagnetic field pollution, etc. So they're very, very broad and very, very different, those categories. So these rating agencies have a very difficult job of taking all these things that are kind of unrelated to each other and putting them in one single index. So I think that by itself is an extremely complicated aspect. There are many shortcuts that the rating agencies need to take to produce that, or at least many judgments that they have to do to produce that. And the outcome has been that the ratings that they provide to the same firms are very uncorrelated with each other. So this is the ESG ratings from about 1,000 firms that are common to all these rating agencies. These rating agencies today have already been acquired by somebody else. RobecoSAM will be, for example, the S&P, Sustainalytics will be Morningstar. So there has been a huge amount of consolidation. This is from a paper before these rating agencies were acquired. So MSCI still is MSCI. KLD, for example, has been discontinued or is going to be discontinued. So these data sources were the ones that we had access. At the time, what we did was to request that they give us the data, the raw data, because I wanted to understand the degrees of discrepancy. Now, let me just show you more or less how the discrepancy looks like. The next slide. So it would be hard for you to see the names of the firms. So, you can look at the paper. But what I've done here is to rank all the 1,000 firms. And I picked the firms where there's very high level of agreement. And you can see that they are kind of all tied together. So these are different rating agencies. And in fact, they are not identical. But if you're in the top 20% for one rating agency, very likely you are in the top 20% for the other rating agency. And in fact, this happens for many, many firms. And by the way, in the bottom of that list, there are many Japanese firms, and the reason is because this survey was collected in 2013. In 2013, they were coming out of the tsunami, and therefore many firms did not disclose any information. And when you don't disclose, the rating agencies presume the worst. There are some rating agencies that the classification is very coarse, and you can see that there are many blue dots that are one on top of each other. That's because how the information is collected by these rating agencies and how it's aggregated and shown. But the point I want to say is there are good firms that there's agreement on very good firms, and there are bad firms in which there's agreement on bad firms. The next slide will show you more or less how the data looks. I have organized this by looking at the median of the ratings, and I call this a confetti plot. And this is just what it says is that there are some firms, and by the way, you will know most of the firms that are here, first, Samsung, etc. For these firms, they can be on the bottom 10% for a rater and in the top 5% for another rater. It's just, they are all over the place. Now they look like they are aligned is because I organized them by the median, but except for that, this is just spread out all over the place. This is a problem, because if you have to make a decision about, well, which firms do I want to support? Which firms do I think are treating their customers correctly? Which firms are treating their communities correctly? Which firms are producing harmful products? Which ones are destroying the environment, etc.? I would like to know. Well, by looking at the rating agency, it will be hard, except for a few where there's tight agreement. There's a massive disagreement. Just to give you an idea, if you compute the simple correlation among these, I think it's 160 firms that we were able to fit in the graph. If you compute the correlation here, it will give you exactly 0. Okay, all the raters are almost uncorrelated. Next slide. So what we did in the paper, and with this I'm going to finish, is that we define attributes, things that are the aspects that we would like to measure. So in other words, we want to know how the firms are treating the workers, and very particular, it's actually not workers. The attributes are very narrowly defined. So this is treatment of women, okay? So it would be labor treatment of women, labor treatment of different religions, labor treatment of different ethnicities, etc. So it's very precise. The attributes are kind of very narrowly defined. The way we defined these attributes was by interviewing the rating agencies and trying to understand what they were trying to capture by reading what they were supposed to be measuring and then collecting that into attributes. So we have many attributes, much more than the ones that mostly they will be thinking about evaluating. Now, the next slide. First thing that we did, because we had access to that raw data, we had the intentions, what they were supposed to be trying to measure. That's the attribute. But then we observe what indicator they use for that attribute. And it happens to be that the difference between these two guys is what we call the measurement error. Next slide. So very interesting. Just by looking at this error, this explains about 50% of the errors in the data. Okay? So 50% of the variation that you observe across the rating agencies is explained by this. Then, there was another aspect that we found, that there were some attributes that were next slide, sorry. There were some attributes that were not taken into account by some rating agencies. And there were some rating agencies, for example, the Europeans, had many attributes that were related to labor and labor treatment. In the US, they were mostly governance. So they were the same number of attributes, but very different things. So, see, this implies that whatever indicator you're going to produce, you have very little chance to actually get the same rating. And these ratings, we call this the scope error or the information set error. This explains about 40% of the variation. Next slide. And then what they do is they put this into one indicator. That's an aggregation rule. And those aggregation rules produce also errors. They were smaller. It was less than 10. But in other words, if you pick the exact same attributes and you pick the exact same measurements on all of those, the different weights and the different forms of aggregation will produce about 10% discrepancy. So it was not as big as we thought it was going to be. So what we're trying to do is to understand, and in particular, I'm working on the measurement, is to try to understand how we can produce better measurements by combining these indicators. The reason why these indicators are different is that, for example, in Europe, in Latin America as well, when we do when you are mistreating a worker, it's very likely that we go to a labor court. It's very common that we go to labor courts. And therefore, in that sense, if you want to measure treatment of workers in Latin America or in Europe, looking at labor court complaints is a very good indicator. In the US, the workers will tend to quit. See, we don't quit in Latin America, but in the United States, they will quit and they will find another job. So here in the US, it will be a turnover. In fact, what happened is that the same company, Citibank France and Citibank US, the mistreatment will show in different indicators. And what happened is that these rating agencies pick one, but they don't use both. So there's a way in which once you can match the indicators, I think we will be able to do this. Let me finish the presentation here because this is what I wanted to say. I think that the measurement of ESG requires us to think about from the ethical point of view, what are you planning to measure, what you measure and how you measure that. And when we do that, we will be able at least to solve 50% of that discrepancy. I think the other 50%, which is aggregation and scope, should be relatively easy to solve with transparency. The measurement is where I think we have to work. So let me finish there. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Roberto. That was really great. And I think you've brought out a whole bunch of interesting features and attributes of alternative data and big data that we want to take into consideration. So I think this is a good framework for many of the new data projects that will be developing over time, given that we are seeing the streams of interesting new data appearing as well in the financial sector. We'll move on now to a talk by Darryl, and I'll quickly introduce Darryl and then give him the floor. Darryl Duffy is a Canadian financial economist, and he's Dean Witter Distinguished Professor of Finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. Darryl has obviously written many articles and several books as well. Several of them I had to study for my PhD, so he's been writing for a long time, and has served both the academic and practitioner communities over the years. Darryl was at Stanford since 1984 on the faculty, and of course even before that, because he got his PhD at Stanford. So that's a nice coincidence that both Roberto and Darryl got their PhDs at their home institutions. Darryl's a fellow and member of the Council of the Econometric Society, a research associate at the NBER, a member of the Financial Advisory Roundtable at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Darryl was the president of the American Finance Association in 2009, and of course he served on the boards of many journals, including Econometrica. Darryl was also awarded the Financial Engineer of the Year award by the International Association of Financial Engineers. So very wide range of work. So today Darryl will be speaking about cryptocurrencies, data around cryptocurrencies, managing the interactions, and something that's an interesting topic that's just emerging, which is the role of central banks in crypto markets as well. So Darryl, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the generous introduction. It's always hard to follow Roberto, but let me try. I also want to thank Chair McWilliams and Diane and all the organizers, really helpful. And the setup for this has been wonderful. And I'm just honored that Roberto and I are the first of your series. And I am going to connect with big data today through the lens of a new central bank digital currency that's just being introduced by China. And I'm going to go kind of deliberately through what it is and why it's happening and its big data implications in terms of privacy and security of data. But this is not going to go into numbers yet. We don't know yet much about China's central bank digital currency. It's just going through testing phases. And so there will be lots of interesting research about that. I'm going to focus on the international implications of China's central bank digital currency for countries like the United States, partly because I'm co-directing a new research group on that with Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who's an expert on China from a socio-political viewpoint. This is a large working group centered in the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And it's too early to discuss any findings yet, but we have experts from computer science, economics, national security, and other areas that are focusing on exactly the same issues that I'm going to address today. Again, no findings yet. So if I could have the next slide, please, just to tee this up. What you're looking at is basically the prototypical payment situation. Here is Alice, who's at a bakery in Beijing. She needs to pay Bob the baker 80 renminbi for some bakery goods. Now you might ask, well, why is it Alice and Bob? They're in China after all. But in the payments literature, the technical literature, it's always Alice and Bob, Alice paying Bob. So let's discuss how they're going to do that. If I could have the next slide, please. The traditional way to do this around the world for the last several centuries, in fact, has been for Alice to send a message to her bank, which in turn forwards the money by various debits and credits through the payment rails in the banking system to Bob's bank. Bob gets the message that, at least if it's a modern transaction, pretty quickly, that eventually his bank will be getting that money, and he hands over the bakery goods to Alice. And I'm not going to try to describe the complicated payment rails between them, except to say that we're moving away from that in some countries, like China. Next slide, please. The traditional payment rails would have Alice say who's customer one of bank one in this schematic diagram. Her payment would be merged from other payments coming from the customers of bank one that are destined for bank three. They're likely to go through a central bank-based payment system like Fedwire in the US, or through a private settlement system like CHIPS. Eventually, in the United States, Bob will get his money. He might be customer 7 of bank 3. And it might take a few days. And in the United States, there's an enormous interchange fee for the common credit card-based method of doing that. And there is quite a lot of spaghetti involved in these payment rails. The United States is actually way behind China in retail payments. In China, this transaction would happen instantly. Bob would not need to wait for the money. And it would happen most likely through WeChat Pay or Alipay, which are the two mobile phone-based large payment systems in China. Simply the volumes on those two payment systems within China exceeds the total amount of payments globally on all credit cards. And while that's shocking, it's true. China is it's basically leapfrogged the US payment system and gone to a mobile phone-based payment system. And now China is planning to roll out yet another advance in digital payments. Next slide, please. Central bank digital currency. And first I'm going to explain what it is, and then I'm going to talk about its implications. So what is it, first of all? Well, it's basically Alice and Bob have accounts at the central bank, which is the People's Bank of China. And Alice is going to send a message through her payment service provider, which could be a bank or a fintech firm like WeChat Pay. That message will cause the money in Alice's account at the central bank to move over into Bob's account. And then Bob will get a message via his payment service provider that the transfer has occurred. In the concept that China has produced for this system, they call it two-tiered. The gold record, if you like, of the account-based money is in the People's Bank of China, but the two payment service providers have all of the data associated with payments by their own customers. So the data are kept essentially in two places, and the payment service providers are responsible for distributing the digital currency and possibly for overlays that combine this kind of payment service with other application program interfaces, but that is yet to be seen. Now the question arises, why is China doing this? Well, there are several sets of motives. First of all, the economics of the monetary arrangements are being re-examined in almost every country. The Bank for International Settlements has done a survey, and roughly 86% of central banks globally are doing R&D on introducing a central bank digital currency. It remains to be seen how many will actually do that. The United States is doing some research on that between the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and MIT. But as yet, as Chair Powell of the Federal Reserve has said, the United States would rather get it right than be first. In other words, the Fed is so far not in a hurry to compete with China in introducing a digital currency. On the other hand, there's been a fair bit of commentary recently in the US press about whether the Fed should introduce a central bank digital currency and what to do about China's digital currency electronic payment system. And for those of you that follow Bloomberg, the headline on Friday in Bloomberg was that the Biden administration is concerned about the implications of China's digital currency. And these concerns can be raised over various possible issues. Could it threaten the reserve currency status of the US dollar? Could it be a concern with respect to the privacy of payments that are conducted? Could it be a concern with respect to competition in technology provision on payment services around the world or for banking services? Well, as I said, we're looking into those issues, but I'm not going to be able to give you any findings yet. But I am personally very interested in the economics of this. Inside China, the government has an eye on the large fintech firms, Tencent and Ant Group, and one might guess that they're concerned about the dominance of these two fintech firms. They've recently been more heavily regulated with respect to how they treat their customers, and also with respect to monopoly power, and also with respect to financial stability. And perhaps China wants to be able to provide an alternative or backup payment system. There are other concerns within China. For example, the large commercial banks who would normally conduct most of these payments are really losing in the competition for retail payments with these new mobile phone-based payment systems. And those large banks are state-owned and state-controlled. That could be a potential motive for China. Some have discussed the international motive of increasing the internationalization of the renminbi so that other countries might start to use this digital currency or might use the technology from China. So all of these issues remain to be determined. Let me give you on the next slide a little bit more on the structure of the digital currency electronic payment system that China is introducing. So the People's Bank of China, as I indicated in the previous diagram, is not directly facing individual consumers in China. Instead, they're working through banks, telecom companies, and fintech payment service providers. And I oversimplified in the previous diagram with the nature of the transaction. There are many alternative ways that this digital currency could be used. Some of them actually preserve a remarkable amount of anonymity, and some of them, for larger size payments, give a lot of data, and the users lose a lot of anonymity. If you're interested in following this, there's been some recent speeches and writings on this by the head of the People's Bank of China's digital currency initiative, whose name is Mu Changchun. So I recommend you read some of what he's written about issues like anonymity and privacy of your payment data. The PBOC calls this controlled anonymity. So they have various levels of anonymity that they're providing, and generally speaking, they're going to have all of the records for who has what, but the payment service providers will have less information, and users of the payment system may have less information about each other's uses. So that's, in terms of big data, there's going to be a wealth of data available to the People's Bank of China, and it remains to be seen exactly how they use those data. I think this is one of the biggest concerns for central banks around the world. How much data do they actually want to control and be responsible for in terms of data privacy, and also in terms of the responsibility for monitoring payments for legality, anti-money laundering, know your customer, countering the financing of terrorism. That's a lot of responsibility for the central bank to manage. Technology will be paramount in protecting the privacy of the data, while at the same time controlling illegal payments. And so many central banks may use a two-tiered system and resign responsibility for some of that data security and monitoring to a second tier of commercial providers. There's also issues, of course, about financial innovation and technology innovation. If you want to use a digital currency for smart contracts, for programmable money, and for other applications, perhaps the private sector is better positioned to do some of that financial innovation. On the international front, next slide, please. This schematic illustrates a simple cross-border payment situation in which customer one of bank one, that might have been Alice, actually wants to pay Bob, customer two of bank six in another country. And in the current arrangements for that are quite cumbersome and expensive for either Alice or Bob or both. As indicated in the schematic, Alice would instruct her bank to send the money to a bank like Bank 3, which has a correspondent banking relationship with a bank in another country. That would be Bank 4. This could be Argentina, for example. And then Bank 4 would have a relationship with Bob's bank, and eventually Bob would get the money, but possibly after a large deduction of fees and quite a long delay. This is one of the concerns of the current international payment arrangements and domestic payment arrangements. There are many, many routes by which money can go from one end user to another, and along the route, there are delays and there are costly operational steps, and there's also rent taking, which is, as you know, what economists say when people are extracting profits. And so changing to a new technology may simplify that process. In terms of the international use of China's central bank digital currency, next slide, please. A former official of the People's Bank of China, now chairman of China's National Institute of Financial Research, at a recent speech at the World Economic Forum said, quote, "So let's say if Singapore was willing to have the Chinese digital currency moving to Singapore, and China was willing to accept the Singapore digital currency. Maybe the two countries can sign a deal to work on those things." The idea being here that if you have two interoperable central bank digital currencies, a lot of the spaghetti of correspondent banking and the costs and delays associated with it might be simplified. Of course, if China is effective at the kinds of arrangements that are described here, then that would leave a commercial advantage for China relative to, let's say, the United States in providing cross-border payments, both technology-wise and also with respect to the use of the currency. Could I have the next slide, please? Recently, Christopher Hui, who's the Secretary for Financial Services in the Treasury of Hong Kong, said at a meeting of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, quote, "In the event that the PBOC would like to explore the use of DCEP in places outside of the mainland, including Hong Kong, the government and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority will actively respond and collaborate." And in fact, the HKMA and the People's Bank of China have recently entered into an arrangement for cross-border use of China's new central bank digital currency. I'm speaking for myself now, personally, I'm relatively sanguine about the idea that the dollar is threatened. I don't think that it's significantly threatened, or even in the midterm, as long as China maintains capital controls, because it's very difficult to displace a highly used central bank digital currency, a highly used currency like the US dollar, with a currency for which there are capital controls. So putting that aside, China is, of course, growing fast. Its economy is nearly the size of the United States. And in the distant future, if China were to relax its capital controls, it's quite possible that the renminbi would be an important, let's call it reserve currency, by which I mean a method of payments a stable place to store money over the short term. But in the near term, unless China relaxes its capital controls, I think concerns about the United States losing the status of reserve currency for the dollar might be, we might put those to rest for the near term. With respect to data security, for now, it's very speculative to say whether China's security over its central bank digital currency data will be problematic or actually not. So I'm not going to try to speculate on that. Sanjeev, I would actually prefer to have more time for Q&A and less time for me talking. So I'm going to stop talking here, and hopefully you and some of the other participants will have some questions that I can address. But I think I've hopefully laid out what is China's central bank digital currency and what are some of the potential international impacts of it, both with respect to the monetary arrangements and also with respect to the privacy and security of data and large databases. I should mention one more thing, which is once you have all of these data, they can be used for many other purposes than simply monitoring transactions. They can be used to do monetary policy, forecasting economic activity for monetary policy purposes, and they can be used, as I mentioned, for monitoring for the legality of payments and many other purposes for which big data is well suited. But as I said, it's too early to tell with respect to China.
Thanks, Darryl. So we have received a bunch of questions actually in the chat as well. So one of the questions is just administrative. Darryl mentioned somebody who was a Chinese head of digital currency, and somebody just wanted to know who the person was. So
yeah, so this is family name is Mu, M-U, and his name is Chang Chun, C-H-A-N-G-C-H-U-N.
Oh, okay. So I think I did.
So if you plug that into Google and put in China, or DCEP, digital currency electronic payments, you'll see all of his speeches. By the way, there's also an excellent essay by former Governor Zhou Xiaochuan, the last governor of the People's Bank of China, on DCEP if you want to read more about it.
There's an interesting question from the audience about the retail side of central bank digital currency, and the questioner asked if you can talk a little bit about the trade in this respect. Specifically, could you talk a little bit about the role for energy conglomerates, particularly oil companies, as users of the new central bank digital currencies? It's often said that petrodollars anchor the US dollar at the center of global payment systems because of how international trade in commodities, particularly oil, accounts for a substantial portion of cross-border currency flow. Do you see the one substituting the US dollar to price commodities and so on? Could the Chinese government create a requirement to settle the commodity trades in China in the digital one, not the regular one?
Well, this is a great question. So first of all, it is true that central bank digital currencies, or any currencies, are more heavily used when they're more heavily when there is trade invoicing in those currencies. And there's a paper on this by Jeremy Stein that shows there's a high relationship between the use of a currency for trade invoicing purposes and the use. This is a paper by Geeta Gopinath and Jeremy Stein, and the use of the currency for other purposes. Those are highly related. Will China's central bank digital currency become heavily used for cross-border payments of things like oil? Possibly. One issue that's very sensitive is, and has been discussed with respect to China's central bank digital currency, is the fact that the US sometimes applies sanctions on other countries like Iran. And if, for example, China were to settle a payment for oil from Iran with its digital currency, it would be possible in principle, if Iran and China set up digital currency arrangements with each other, to avoid that sanction. So that's a sensitive issue. Now you have to ask, well, what would Iran do with China's central bank digital currency once it has it? It holds an account at the PBOC, in effect. Can it convert that to a global currency that puts it back into a similar situation of being under a sanction, unless the trade is entirely between Iran and China? I'm not sure if I've addressed the question. The question could go also to the issue of supply chains and smart contracts. Once you have a central bank digital currency, if it's done on a ledger, by the way, China's is not done on blockchain, but if it is done on a blockchain, you can make it atomic money, which means you can arrange for very smart settlement of cross-border or even domestic trade along the supply chain, by which you don't need a lot of intermediaries, you don't need to take counterparty risk. The coins themselves have on their, printed on them, this coin will belong to Sanjeev Das in 2 days, provided the oil is delivered and with a recognized invoice at our port at Dalian. And if that's the case, then you're going to be, supply chain settlement is going to be much simplified. But again, China is using a database management, a traditional database management system for its central bank digital currency. So it has a limited opportunity to do that sort of thing.
There were a few related questions as well about the impact of the CBDC. So maybe I'll just give you all of them at one go, and you can comment holistically on the whole lot.
I'll never remember them all, Sanjeev.
Yes, there's questions about what are your thoughts about cybersecurity, the monetary impact of cryptocurrencies, the impact of this on financial stability, which is in many cases facilitated through commercial banks, and so on. So, basically questions about impact on security, monetary impact, and financial stability.
Okay, I think I can remember that many. So with respect to cybersecurity, well, it goes back to the same issue. Probably if a larger country like China or the United States were to develop a central bank digital currency, they would put every possible effort into its security against hacking and other cyber incidents. Having said that, even if it's much more resilient, you're also putting a lot more of your eggs into one basket. In other words, you become a single point of failure in the payment system if you're the only, or if you're the majority of the payment system. So that kind of raises the ante on cybersecurity. Beyond that, I don't have any big insights into cybersecurity. It's more of a technology issue. Remember, of course, that the current banking system is also subject to cyber attacks. And I wrote some work on that with Josh Younger at JP Morgan about the potential for instability in the banking system associated with cyber attacks. So I think you need to pick your poison on cyber. On monetary, well, there's some wonderful work by Ulrich Binzeil, who's he's an executive at the European Central Bank, who's written about the role of central bank digital currencies for monetary policy transmission. And he talks about the possibility of remuneration of a central bank digital currency. You could pay it a different interest rate than you pay to banks on their central bank deposits. And so it gives the central bank more flexibility. So far, it seems to me most central banks are likely to issue CBDC with no interest remuneration, just like paper money doesn't pay you interest. And because of that, the opportunity to change monetary policy through the interest rate offered on central bank digital currency is diminished. There is, however, the monetary policy transmission will be affected by a fast payment system, whether it's CBDC or a bank railed fast payment system because the velocity of money has changed and the efficiency of the payment system has an impact on monetary monetary policy. On financial stability, I'm not as concerned as some have been that in a financial crisis, all the money would get sucked out of all the bank accounts and put into the central bank digital currency. First of all, in a financial crisis, deposits tend to go up, not down. They tend to run from weaker banks to safer banks, but I don't think it changes the equation much if you add to the mix of safe short-term assets a central bank digital currency. Maybe it becomes a bit more convenient to move your money. Further, there can be limits placed on the amount of central bank digital currency that one can hold or that one can move at one time. And I'm not that concerned about financial stability. There is an issue of disruption of the banking system, which I know is of great interest to the FDIC.
Yeah.
The banks now rely heavily on profits associated with both payments and deposit taking. Let me break that down. On the payment side, the United States has a very expensive payment system, much more so than Europe. And a lot of that is on the retail side. Credit card interchange fees are very high. Banks get a certain amount of that. And banks also have the opportunity to offer deposit services with very low interest rates compared to wholesale money market rates, which means that banks are profiting significantly from that spread. And if a central bank digital currency were to cause people like you, Sanjeev, to say, well, I don't need to store my cash in my bank account earning almost no interest anymore. I can just put a little bit on my digital wallet and put the rest in a money market fund. And it can go anywhere and do anything with my mobile phone. The demand to place deposits may go down. Banks may have to compete for that by paying higher interest rates. The total amount of deposit taking may remain high, but the interest rate that's paid on it may go up significantly. So I don't know if you call that a source of financial instability. I think banks would compensate for that by raising capital or getting funding from other sources, but it would reduce the profitability of banking. And my guess is that there would be some challenge for banks in dealing with that. Jamie Dimon wrote about that in his shareholder letter of about 10 days ago, that banks need to wake up to the challenge posed by fintech to some of their traditional profitable franchises.
Thanks, Darryl. There's a few questions also for Roberto, so I'll I think pivot to that. There's a question about how regulators will use new data. So the question says, Yale economist Gary Gorton contends that regulators miss important trends because what they look for is driven by the theories they hold. Given the premise, will this change in the new world of alternative data, and if so, how? In fact, there's an excellent quote by the editor of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, who said this about 15 years ago, that data is a new theory, and so it's sort of changing the sequence in which you sort of drive decision making. So if you care to comment on that, and then you can follow up with a few more questions as well.
Yeah, I agree. So it's a very good question, because the way we will say it is that you are what you measure. So there's a total heterogeneity there. So the regulator measures something, and then we act based on that. And our theories are based on the things that we can measure and we can test. So our imagination goes through that. So I think it goes both ways. Yes, I think that alternative data sources allow you to look at the same events differently, and it will challenge many of our theories. So I think that it's unfortunate in economics, we don't publish enough stylized facts as much as we did in the past. But some of the great theories that we created in economics started with a tiny stylized fact that we couldn't explain, and we are not publishing enough of that. So if you want, so that's one aspect. So the big data is going to force us to look at different stylized facts, and therefore we will need to have different theories. Yeah, so, actually, I think it's natural both ways.
The other question has been asked is really organic data collection given the method and the way you actually collect organic data, isn't that also considered intrusive in the first place, sort of by definition?
Well, yes and no, depends on. So intrusiveness here refers to answering questions and where you can manipulate the answer of those questions. So, for example, talking a little bit about cryptocurrency, we are not going to do, nobody pays buying drugs with a credit card. I mean, illegal drugs, okay? So we don't use the credit card. So even though you can say, well, the payment system is reflected of what we buy, well, yes and no, because if I know that they're tracking me, I will have no incentives to pay with that tracking system. So there still is some type of manipulation that exists there. Now, people very rarely randomly search for words in Google, okay? So when we actually go at Google and we type something in Google, it's because we're interested. You have just provided Google something, is that you are interested in something. In Wikipedia, I don't know if you have noticed, but the stories in Wikipedia have become shorter and shorter through time, but there are more links. So actually there's more web pages, but they want you to click more. Why? Because every time you click, you're telling Wikipedia what you're interested in. And therefore, you're revealing parts of who you are. You're leaving breadcrumbs through our life and through our activity. That's the non-intrusive part. Now, if you use these to hurt the consumers, then this is it's not intrusive, it's malicious. I don't classify it as intrusive. Intrusive is when I actually bother you to answer a question. It's what they do in Santa Clara when you're walking in the street and they ask you for a donation, okay? That's intrusive, but it's not malicious. If I listen at the music that you listen, Sanjeev, and I use that to detect when you are sad, and then I use that to sell you chocolate and give you an email and send it, that's malicious. If I use that information and I detect that you are close to be depressed, and I tell a loved one to call you and to reach, well, then it has a different purpose. So the purpose here is very important. The organic aspect is about the ability that you, without noticing, you are reflecting your state of mind in the music that you listen, for example, or in the things that you do. So these are like little breadcrumbs that you leave. We have to gather them and then capture part of what you are as an individual. Now, that's never complete. As if you remember what I said, I emphasized from the very beginning, this has to be a hybrid approach. This is super imperfect because I don't capture all the stuff. I think that Darryl raised his hand. He wants to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to add to your comment, which I agreed with, which is that the more that you attempt to surveil with your data collection method, the more that users will attempt to avoid using that. And China brought in this digital currency initiative several years ago because of Bitcoin. That was the primary motive. Now the motives have been changing since then. Libra or Diem, now it's called, another cryptocurrency, has also entered the fray, and China is trying to avoid that. And its idea is, well, people won't use these hard to track cryptocurrencies if we can get ahead of it with a central bank digital currency. And of course, I'm sure China's authorities are thinking carefully about the idea, if we surveil hard on our central bank digital currency, people will not use it. So if I'm going to introspect it. If I were at the People's Bank of China, I would say, let's cool it on the surveillance. Maybe we'll look at the data, but we're not going to use it as far as anybody is concerned for surveillance purposes. And then maybe once everybody really likes it a lot and it's heavily used and the network effects are so great, maybe then if we really want to exploit the data, people might find the switching costs away from that currency to be more difficult to overcome.
See, the way I would use that, the way, I think that's a fantastic point. So if I had access to the People's Republic digital currency, I will use that to measure daily retail sales, an estimate of GDP weekly. If we are a measure of all the payment system in one single place, consumer confidence will be there. As you said, people, if they have fear, they will change their saving behavior, and in fact, they will switch from stock market to put that in the central bank account. So I will use it for so many benevolent objectives, That's all. To complement and manage our economy better, that I would love to do that. In fact, combine that with the tax payments and all the electronic VAT that we collect in most countries. Every time you do a transaction, there's an electronic VAT that was collected. So we have two measures of GDP. I will be constructing one weekly. So forget about this quarterly stuff and forget about revisions. This is going to be perfect.
So we have a few minutes left, and so I'll just try and wrap up and leave a few seconds for both of you to sort of, offer some thoughts on it. But sort of the progression of fintech has really been about using technology to disintermediate the usual players in finance. And I think both the topics that you all spoke about are really about using data now to disintermediate the usual players in finance. So it's a sort of different progression from technology disintermediation to actually data disintermediation. So, when the Chinese central bank gets this digital currency, they actually can use data to sort of change the banking system by disintermediating the root of data. Roberta, you have a whole bunch of data in your back pocket, and you can disintermediate a bunch of people that provide statistics, economic statistics, or provide ratings and metrics if you can automate this process using technology as well. So it seems to me that data disintermediation is sort of a new theme in big data, in fintech, and in sort of the banking sector. And I don't know if I can leave you a couple of minutes to comment on that. And of course, it brings up issues of intrusiveness, cost, regulation, privacy, monetary policy, financial stability, as well as many of the other topics that we talked about today. So I think that's sort of one of the themes that we can use to bring all this together. And I was just wondering if we've seen work that sort of talks about it in that vein.
Me first?
Yes.
Okay. So I actually think that the census, the BLS, they will reinvent themselves. Like we were discussing at the beginning of this chat that there's no substitute to human contact, and COVID has taught that. I think that there's no substitute to collecting the data carefully and getting every data point right. That doesn't mean that we cannot substitute certain aspects, but I do think that this has to be a hybrid approach. So that we will just complement what we're doing with data that has different properties, very big speed, very cheap, and therefore we will be able to construct a better measurement of the economy that will allow us to manage and regulate better. And I think that that's the challenge. So the way I always say it is that we want the small data to correct the biases of the big data. So I mean, actually, I don't say it that way. I said I want the survey data to correct the biases of the organic data, but doing a search and replace, that's what I will do. So I think that areas in which the data gathering will be substituted, that's for sure. Because if we can, like the electronic currency, if we get the transactions in all accounts in the central bank, well, the gathering of the data is simpler. I understand that. So that part will be substituted away. But now we will actually have to work much harder to understand and analyze that data. I think it will not make it simpler. It will make it more complicated. So the statistical offices are going to grow in a different direction. They will have more computer scientists and statisticians. And in fact, we need to create statisticians that know economics, that know computer science, and know programming. And they know an MBA. In fact, if you think about it, the way we do that, we have a team of 5. We have a statistician, a computer programmer, a computer scientist, an economist, and the MBA. And you ask, why do you need the MBA? Well, somebody has to do the PowerPoint, okay?
Thanks, Roberto. Darryl, any final remarks?
Well, it's a cliche, but I think the data has become the technology. So the boundary between technology and data is essentially disappearing, especially in the blockchain era. But even in China's central bank digital currency, which is not a blockchain-based application, the whole thing is who has the data. China has been very careful about this issue of not taking data away from private sector participants in the payment system because of its two-tier approach. So each bank will continue to have all the data that it currently has for its own customers. The difference is, of course, now you have a central database. And I think, personally, I think it's going to change not only the data arrangements, but also it'll change the economics of banking quite significantly. because of credit provision and because of participation on the payment system will be radically disrupted. So I think there is the data concerns that we've all been speaking about are very, very important, probably the most important issue, but the economics of the monetary arrangements and credit provision are also going to be quite different in 10 years, I think, in any country that moves in this direction.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, both Darryl and Roberto. I just wanted to inform the audience as well that the event is recorded. It'll be posted on the website, so you can go back to it if need be. And we'll collect some of the questions we couldn't get to and send them to you, Darryl and Roberto, as well. Once again, thanks to everyone for organizing this at the FDIC and at Santa Clara. And really appreciate your time, Darryl and Roberto.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sanjeev.
Yeah,
it's great to see you, Roberto.
Great to see you too.
Great seeing you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Thank you.